What happens when Hollywood's most beloved grumpy legend meets a talk show host who thinks he can push any boundary for a laugh? When Harrison Ford walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's set that evening, he expected the usual promotional routine for his latest film. What he got instead was a confrontation that would expose just how far some hosts will go to create viral moments, even at the expense of their guests' dignity. This is the story of how one of cinema's greatest icons refused to play along with a host's desperate attempt at manufactured controversy, and why Harrison Ford ended up walking off stage in front of a stunned live audience. Make sure you subscribe and drop a comment because this story reveals a side of late-night television that most people never see. Harrison Ford arrived at the studio in his typical understated fashion, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jacket, looking every bit the unpretentious movie star who has always seemed uncomfortable with the Hollywood machine. At 79 years old, Ford had done countless interviews over his decades-long career, and he approached them all with the same professional resignation. He was there to promote his latest project, nothing more, nothing less. His publicist had briefed him on the usual talking points, the film clips they would show, and the light-hearted anecdotes Jimmy might ask him to share. Behind the scenes, Jimmy Kimmel was dealing with mounting pressure from network executives who were demanding higher ratings and more social media engagement. The late-night landscape had become increasingly competitive, with hosts constantly trying to outdo each other with outrageous stunts and controversial moments. Jimmy's team had been brainstorming ways to create more buzz around their celebrity interviews, and they had identified Harrison Ford as the perfect target for what they called aggressive interviewing tactics. The reasoning was simple but cynical. Ford's reputation for being difficult in interviews was well established. He was known for giving short, sometimes sarcastic answers, and for his general discomfort with the promotional side of his career. Jimmy's producers believed that if they could push Ford's buttons in just the right way, they could create a memorable television moment that would generate the kind of online discussion that translates to viewership. What they failed to consider was that there's a significant difference between someone who is naturally reserved and someone who can be easily manipulated. Harrison Ford had survived decades in Hollywood precisely because he understood how to protect himself from people who wanted to exploit his image for their own gain. He had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was trying to use him, and he had no patience for those kinds of games. The show began normally enough. Jimmy delivered his opening monologue with his characteristic energy, making jokes about current events and building toward the introduction of his guest. The audience was excited to see Harrison Ford, with many fans having grown up watching him in iconic roles from Han Solo to Indiana Jones. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the studio as Jimmy began his introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest tonight is a true Hollywood legend who has entertained audiences for over 5 decades, Jimmy announced with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. From a galaxy far, far away to ancient temples around the world, he's brought some of cinema's most beloved characters to life. Please welcome Harrison Ford. The audience erupted in applause as Ford made his entrance, acknowledging the crowd with a modest wave before settling into the guest chair with his characteristic stoic expression. The first few minutes proceeded, exactly as Ford had expected. Jimmy asked about his latest film. They showed a clip, and Ford provided his typical, concise but professional responses. He talked briefly about working with the director, praised his co-stars, and shared one mildly amusing story from the set. It was standard promotional fare, the kind of interview Ford had given hundreds of times before. But those watching closely might have noticed that Jimmy seemed restless, frequently glancing at his cards and toward his producers off stage. The shift came when Jimmy decided to abandon the agreed-upon topics and venture into territory that Ford's team had specifically marked as off-limits. Instead of continuing to discuss the film, Jimmy leaned back in his chair with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Harrison, I have to ask you about something that's been bothering me for years," he began, his tone taking on a more aggressive edge. "You have this reputation for hating interviews. for being difficult with the press. Some people say you're just ungrateful for the success you've had. What's your response to that?" The question was clearly designed to provoke a reaction. Ford's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle tightening around his eyes that indicated his growing irritation. "I think people who know me understand that I take my work seriously," he replied evenly. "I'm here to talk about the film and the people I worked with to make it. I don't see how my personal feelings about doing interviews are relevant to anything." But Jimmy wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic response. He had committed to this approach, and he was determined to get the reaction his producers wanted. "But come on, Harrison," he pressed, leaning forward now with the aggressive posture of someone who thinks they smell weakness. "You make millions of dollars making movies, and then you act like it's torture to sit here and talk about them for 20 minutes. Don't you think that comes across as a little bit entitled?" The word entitled hung in the air like a challenge. Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled when he responded. "Jimmy, I've been doing this job since before you were born. I've sat through thousands of interviews with journalists and television hosts who understood that there's a difference between asking questions and picking fights. If you want to have a conversation about the film, I'm happy to do that. If you want to psychoanalyze me for your audience's entertainment, you picked the wrong person." The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity banter they had expected, and Ford's legendary composure was beginning to show cracks. Jimmy seemed energized by the tension he had created, as if Ford's visible annoyance validated his confrontational approach. Jimmy's response revealed the calculated nature of his attack. Rather than backing down or steering the conversation back to safer ground, he doubled down with the kind of provocative questioning that his producers had been encouraging. "But that's exactly what I'm talking about," he said, spreading his hands as if he were being perfectly reasonable. "You come on shows like this, you give these minimal answers, you act like you're doing everyone a favor just by being here. Meanwhile, there are thousands of actors who would kill for the opportunities you've had." Ford's response was measured but carried an unmistakable edge of warning. "Let me explain something to you, Jimmy. I didn't get where I am by accident. I've worked for 50 years to build a career based on the work, not on how charming I am in interviews. I respect the people who pay to see movies, and I respect the craft of filmmaking. What I don't respect is someone using their platform to create drama where none needs to exist." But Jimmy was committed to his course now, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was rapidly losing control of the situation. "Drama?" he repeated with a laugh that sounded forced even to his own ears. "Harrison, this is just a conversation. If you can't handle a few honest questions, maybe the problem isn't with everyone else." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and it was exactly the wrong tone to take with someone who had spent decades dealing with much more sophisticated attempts at manipulation. Ford stood up from his chair with the deliberate movement of someone who had made a decision. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is trying to use me for their own purposes. You're not interested in having a conversation about the film or my work. You're interested in creating a moment that you think will get people talking about your show." His voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath the calm exterior. "I came here in good faith to talk about a project that a lot of talented people worked very hard on. Instead, you want to turn this into some kind of amateur psychology session where you get to play the role of the provocative interviewer who asks the tough questions. The only problem is, your questions aren't tough, they're just rude." Jimmy tried to regain control of the situation, but his attempt at control only made things worse. "Harrison, please sit down. I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to do here. These are questions that your fans want answered." But Ford was no longer interested in playing along with the charade. "My fans?" he repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You don't speak for my fans. You don't know anything about what they want or why they support the work I do. The legendary actor took a step closer to Jimmy's desk, his presence suddenly commanding the entire studio. What they want is authenticity, respect for the craft, and honest storytelling. What you're offering is cheap sensationalism disguised as legitimate journalism. There's a difference, and if you can't see it, that explains a lot about the current state of television. Jimmy's producers were frantically signaling from the wings, but he seemed determined to salvage something from the confrontation he had created. Look, Harrison, I respect your work, but you have to admit that your attitude toward promotion has always been, let's say, challenging. The word challenging was delivered with a smirk that suggested Jimmy thought he was being clever, but Ford's response cut through the attempted humor like a blade. My attitude toward promotion is professional, Ford replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. I show up, I answer questions about the work, and I treat people with the same respect I expect to receive. What's challenging about that? What's challenging is dealing with people who think that being provocative is the same thing as being interesting, who mistake rudeness for insight. The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something far beyond the usual talk show disagreement. Some were pulling out their phones to record, understanding that they were watching a masterclass in how to handle disrespect with dignity. Jimmy's confident demeanor was beginning to crack as he realized that his approach had backfired spectacularly. I think we should take a commercial break, Jimmy announced, but Ford cut him off immediately. No, Jimmy, we're not taking a break. You started this conversation, so let's finish it. You want to talk about challenging attitudes? Let's talk about yours. How many other guests have you treated this way? How many times have you used your show as a platform to attack people who come here to promote their work? Ford's questions hit their mark with surgical precision. Jimmy's smirk disappeared entirely as the veteran actor continued his counterattack. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've confused controversy with entertainment. You've mistaken disrespect for edginess. And frankly, it's beneath both the medium and the audience that supports it. The confrontation had now completely taken over the show. What was supposed to be a standard promotional interview had become a referendum on the ethics of modern television and the treatment of guests who don't conform to hosts' expectations. Ford had transformed from reluctant interviewee to moral authority, while Jimmy found himself increasingly exposed as someone who had badly miscalculated both his opponent and his strategy. Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to regain the upper hand, but his words only accelerated his own downfall. Harrison, I think you're being way too sensitive about this. If you can't handle a little back and forth, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews at all. The suggestion that Harrison Ford, one of Hollywood's most enduring and successful actors, couldn't handle the pressure of a television interview was so absurd that it actually drew audible gasps from the studio audience. Ford's response was swift and devastating. Sensitive? He repeated, his voice cutting through the studio like a laser. Let me tell you what's sensitive, Jimmy. What's sensitive is a host who's so insecure about his own relevance that he has to attack his guests to feel important. What's sensitive is someone who mistakes cruelty for cleverness and thinks that being confrontational makes him a serious interviewer. He began gathering his things with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else in his life. I've worked with everyone from serious journalists to entertainment reporters who understood how to ask difficult questions with intelligence and respect. What you're doing isn't journalism, and it's barely entertainment. It's just sad, and, frankly, it's an insult to everyone who works in this industry professionally. Jimmy's face was flushed now, his carefully constructed television persona crumbling in real time under the weight of Ford's methodical dismantling of his approach. You can't just walk out in the middle of a live show, he protested, but there was no conviction in his voice. He knew he had lost control completely, and everyone in the studio could see it. Ford turned to face him one final time, and when he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to set boundaries and enforce them. Watch me, he said, with the same quiet intensity he had brought to countless memorable film roles. And while you're watching, maybe think about whether this is really the kind of show you want to host. Whether attacking people who come here, in good faith, is really the legacy you want to build in this business. The studio fell into stunned silence as Ford began walking toward the exit. Jimmy, realizing that his show was disintegrating on live television, made a final desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "Harrison, please, let's just talk about the movie. We can start over." But Ford didn't even slow down. "We're finished, Jimmy. This interview is over, and honestly, so is any respect I might have had for this show or your approach to hosting it." Security personnel, who had been monitoring the situation from the beginning, now found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to escort one of Hollywood's biggest stars off a talk show set. But this wasn't a case of removing someone who was out of control. Instead, they were facilitating the dignified exit of someone who had simply refused to tolerate unprofessional treatment. As Ford walked toward the exit, several audience members began to applaud. It started as scattered clapping from a few people who appreciated his refusal to be bullied, but it gradually built into sustained applause from a significant portion of the studio audience. They understood that they had witnessed something remarkable, a masterclass in maintaining dignity under pressure. Jimmy tried to address the remaining audience members to somehow salvage what was left of his show, but the damage was complete and irreversible. "Well, folks, that was certainly unexpected," he said with a forced laugh that convinced no one. "We'll be right back after these messages." The cameras stopped rolling, but everyone in that studio knew that nothing would ever be quite the same after what they had just witnessed. As Ford reached the exit, he paused for one final moment and looked back at the audience that had supported him throughout the confrontation. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "Thank you for understanding that respect matters, that professionalism matters, and that no one, regardless of their career or status, should have to tolerate being treated poorly just because they're trying to do their job." The aftermath was immediate and intense. Within minutes, footage of the confrontation was spreading across every social media platform. Viewers who had witnessed the exchange live were sharing their shock and admiration for Ford's handling of an impossible situation. The incident sparked widespread discussion about the ethics of ambush interviewing and the responsibility that comes with having a television platform. What had started as Jimmy's attempt to create a memorable television moment had indeed become memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. Instead of showcasing his skills as an interviewer, he had exposed his lack of professionalism and basic respect for his guests. Harrison Ford, meanwhile, had demonstrated why he had remained one of Hollywood's most respected figures for over 5 decades. So there you have it. The complete story of how Harrison Ford turned the tables on Jimmy Kimmel and walked off his show with his dignity completely intact. What do you think about Ford's response? Was he right to refuse to tolerate that kind of treatment? Or should he have stayed and tried to work through the conflict? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button for more incredible behind-the-scenes stories from Hollywood. And let me know what other celebrity confrontations you'd like me to break down next.